Welcome back to the Interesting Lawyers Podcast. Today's guest is a 54-year lawyer, Fred Schwartz. How you doing? Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
The Federal Organized Crime Strike Force. How long were you with them for as a prosecutor?
I was with the strike force for 6.5 years. Before that, I was an assistant district attorney in New York for 9 years.
And for all the rest of that time, you've been on the other side doing defense work, mostly in criminal cases?
I traded my white hat for a gray one.
Okay.
But I did criminal cases almost entirely up until about 15 years ago. Since then, I've been doing a lot of white-collar civil cases, probably about 60% of white-collar civil cases.
But you also defend white-collar criminal cases. Have you in your past handled any cases, either as a prosecutor or a defense attorney, involving the porn industry?
When I was a federal prosecutor, I supervised and tried cases from an investigation called MyPorn, stood for Miami Pornography, only because the agents were based in Miami, Florida. And we set out to prove, at that time, obscenity was illegal based on community standards. We set out to prove that organized crime, Casa Nostra, the Mafia, whatever you want to call it, controlled the making and distribution of pornography in the United States.
Now, you were sharing with me about, just because of the nature of the charges, certain things happen. There's certain evidence that has to be reviewed and shown that would normally never be shown or even discussed or considered in other types of cases. Tell us your memories of handling that case and what you remember.
This was an extensive 3-year investigation where we had 2 undercover FBI agents set up a company to allegedly distribute pornography. And they went around the country targeting all of the major distributors of pornography and working their way up from the low-level people up to the people at the top of the companies. And we ended up indicting 52 people in that case for distribution of pornography. In order to have the case survive a motion to dismiss, there has to be a judicial determination that the films you're talking about are in fact obscene.
Let's visit about that particular point. Tell us about that legal standard and why it was a challenge in any criminal case at the time.
In order for something to be obscene, it has to violate, there are a number of issues, but the main one is it has to violate community standards. And community standards differ throughout the country. What's considered or was considered at the time obscene in New York might be very different than what's considered obscene in McCook, Nebraska. But we were basing it in Miami, so we based it, and all the films were shipped to Miami, so we based it on Miami community standards. And we still had to get by the question of whether it had educational, scientific value or anything like that. So a judge had to view it all. And the judge assigned to the case was a very nice gentleman. At one time, he had represented the Archdiocese of Miami. And he was tasked with viewing, I believe, 226 pornographic films and determining whether they were obscene.
In his opinion?
In his opinion.
Ultimately, was it up to a jury to watch these films and make their own determination if they were obscene or not?
At trial, first it was up to a grand jury as to whether to indict. And we had a grand jury of 23 people sitting for 17 months, 2 days a week, watching pornographic movies, and at that time I think being paid $15 or $20 an hour, a day rather, by the government to watch pornographic movies.
I can see the classified ad listing right now. Get paid to watch porn. And that's what was happening, of course, as part of our justice system.
So the grand jury had to watch the movies and vote whether they were obscene, and we told them the standards as to what's obscene. And once they voted, then there was an indictment, and then because of the First Amendment aspects of all of this, a judge then had to view them on a motion to dismiss to see if they were obscene. I remember walking into this judge's chambers, and he and another judge were sitting there. I don't think they had popcorn, but they were watching pornographic movies in his chambers.
Legitimately. As legitimate as watching porn can be.
50%. One of the judges had to watch it. The other one was keeping him company.
So I was thinking, what if I got a grand jury subpoena and I went down to serve on the grand jury and I came home that night and said, honey, I'm on the grand jury and I have to watch porn movies for the next 13 weeks. I don't think that would sit well with her. Was that an issue with any of your people who were impaneled on the grand jury, or were they just a bunch of single people?
Strangely, it was never an issue. Not one grand juror asked to opt out.
Interesting. Oh, wait a minute. Isn't grand jury service and everything that goes on in the grand jury room confidential and secret?
Yes.
So these people who sat on this grand jury who had to watch all this porn, they were prohibited from going home and telling their wife or significant other about it.
They couldn't talk about the facts. I can generally say they watch porn because it's imperative, it's required for the grand jurors to watch the porn in order to return an indictment. So I'm not violating what's called Rule 6E. But a grand juror couldn't go home and tell his wife, I saw this position, that position, let's try it. That would be improper.
That would be what's known as a reenactment. They're not allowed to do that, right? Pretty funny. All right. These mob people got indicted, and did you ultimately go to trial in that case, or were their pleas taken?
We first indicted it as one large indictment, but they moved, and the judge ruled that it should be separate indictments as to each company. So we had, I think, 10 or 11 different trials.
But they all went to trial.
They all went to trial.
And so now the jury had to sit, the actual jury at the trial, they all had to sit and watch this as well.
There were, since it was divided up, there were only perhaps 10 or 11 films in each case, but they had to watch the films in the courtroom. There were a lot of court observers during those trials.
Oh, they were allowed in to...
Courtrooms are open. Courtrooms are open to the public, and there are people who all they do all day is go in and watch trials. They can tell you who the good lawyers are.
And the good actors.
In these cases, they could.
So what was the disposition of the cases that you prosecuted?
They were convicted.
All right.
Matter of fact, one of the guys who was convicted was allegedly a capo regime in the Gambino crime family. And after the case, he said, gee, I would have liked you to represent me in that case. And then about a year later, after I left the government, he called me and asked me to represent him.
Sometimes you will get clients out of other cases, right?
Yes, usually not that way, though.
And for those who are not familiar, what is a capo regime?
A capo regime is like a captain. The way mafia families, if they exist, are alleged to be structured is there's a boss. We've all heard John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino family for a while. And then there's what's called an underboss. Sammy the Bull Gravano was John Gotti's underboss. And then the families are divided into different units, and each unit has a captain or a capo regime. And it's funny, money gets funneled up ladder. The associates funnel money from their criminal activities to the made guys or the soldiers. The soldiers funnel money to the captains or capo regimes, and the captains give it to the boss and the underboss. Then there's also a consigliere, who's an advisor. That was a Hagen in The Godfather.
Since you got these convictions and helped get the mob, at least to some extent, out of the porn industry, in many ways, you helped clean up the porn industry.
Well,
to the extent that it can be cleaned up at all.
I'd like to take credit for that, but I think the internet made pornography legal. Because now anybody, really any age, who can get a computer can watch pornography.
I could understand how that's definitely a problem, and it's quite different than before. You're talking about your cases were before there was really any internet that was for use by the general public.
Al Gore hadn't invented it yet. The My Porn case was indicted in 1980, and the case is finished being tried, I think, in 84 or 85. There really wasn't an internet back then.
Interesting. Do you have a lot of federal cases that you handle that involve internet in some way or another?
Oh, almost every federal case that I handle now involves some form, some usage of the internet. You have any mail fraud or wire fraud case, the mailing or the wire is now an email, or there are emails involved.
So my understanding these days is that anytime even one email is sent in furtherance of a crime or a conspiracy, that right there becomes a separate charge of, they call it wire fraud,
Correct.
even though it's wireless, right?
It's a wireless fraud, correct. Yeah, that's interesting. When I was a federal prosecutor, I used to say, if you show me a fraud, I'll show you a mailing or a wire or a telephone call involved. The federal government really has jurisdiction over any fraud.
But speaking of handling odd cases, over the years, I've read about cases against psychics who get prosecuted for whether it's ripping people off or exploiting the elderly, getting people to pay them millions. I know that you handled a very high profile criminal case against a psychic. Could you visit with us about that?
Yes, it was a lady who I represented who was a member of the Romani community. Some people call them gypsies. They feel that's an insult. They prefer to be called Romani.
But they evolved, for those not aware, from, I think, they're an Eastern European group.
Originally, they came from people in India who went to spread religion or their religion into Europe, and they wandered around, and because they were darker skinned, the people thought they were Egyptians, and they called them gypsies.
Oh, that's the origin of gypsies. Interesting.
Right. But the Romani people, they have their own language. They've been outsiders throughout history in Europe and here in the United States also, not as much. As a matter of fact, we hear about Hitler killing 6 million Jews. He killed about 1 million gypsies. He called them gypsies, Romani people. They've been outsiders for centuries. Now, my client was a very nice lady who, when I met her, was in her early 60s, who was totally unschooled, uneducated in schools. She spent, I think, a month and a half in school in the 3rd grade. But other than that, her parents wouldn't let her go to school.
And were there cultural reasons for that among the Romani people?
They don't like our culture. They do not like the morals in the United States. They're very male-oriented society. It's funny. The males dominate. The women do the work. The men play golf or drive fancy cars or go to the racetrack. The women raise money for them by their psychic readings. But so Rose was brought up in a household where she sat in the room sometimes when her mother and her aunts and her grandmother were doing psychic readings.
Oh, so she came from a family of psychics. Is being a psychic something that was predominant among Romani women versus women of other ethnic backgrounds?
There's always been a question of whether people really have psychic ability.
That was my next question.
Or people can observe you and understand how you're thinking because they've spent a lifetime observing people and understanding their thought processes. And I tend to believe the latter. I don't think that there's any special ability, but a lot of these women are very bright, and when people talk, there are certain tells, certain things you give up without realizing you give it up, and they take advantage of that. But anyway, Rose was charged with stealing $24 million from her clientele.
How'd you get that?
People paid her to be a life coach People paid her. She had a shop right on the block of the Plaza Hotel, I believe on 56th, just north of Fifth Avenue in New York. And people from the hotel and other people visiting New York would see the shop and go in. And she would do a reading and she'd get paid for it. But some of the people were really entranced by what she said because she would talk about most people who go to psychics are looking for love. They have problems in their love life and they want it to be cured. And the psychics know that. So they talk about your love life and they draw you out on who are you seeing, what are you seeing, and many of them have stories. Oh, this man who you love, who's not paying attention to you, you were you and he were lovers in past lives, and through the centuries you've met up and departed, and that's why you're meant for each other. And his parents made him reject you 400 years ago. And people hear those stories, and a lot of people believe them, particularly if they're desperate. And I'm going to sound chauvinistic now. I hope I'm not. But my experience with the case is most of the clients of the psychic readers, most of the people who were paying my client money were women. And they wanted love, wanted attention from particular men.
What was allegedly illegal? If she was providing the services to them, what was the illegality in obtaining all this money for coaching? Coaching's not illegal.
Funny you should ask that question.
I coach as well. I coach lawyers. In law firms, it's a little bit different, and I don't charge in the millions, but now maybe I'm undercharging.
Maybe you should. The thing is, the government's theory continually changed. There were four superseding indictments. It means they had one set of charges, then when those looked like they weren't going to work, they brought another set of charges and another. And each time we filed the motion to dismiss, their theory would change. Their original theory is you're defrauding people by talking about past lives and reincarnation. You're defrauding people. Sometimes they would say, the problem is that you're under a demonic spell. Demons have put a spell on you. And by talking about demons, that's fraud. No such thing as demons. And then on our witness list, we placed some Hindu monks and some Catholic priests. And we wanted to call them because the Catholic Church believes in demonic possession. We've all seen the movie The Exorcist, and there are still priests who do exorcism. The Hindu religion, Buddhist religion, talks about reincarnation. You're reincarnated through various stages of life until you reach the highest stage of. If well-known, not crank religions, but major religions believe in these things, how can it be fraud for my client to talk about it?
If it's fraud for her, then these religions are committing fraud, and it's never been viewed that way.
So they abandoned that theory. And eventually the theory of the case was my client told her clients that if you're not happy with my services, I'll give you the money back. When the government approached these people who were her clients, and they found them through subpoenaing her bank accounts and seeing checks, etc., and said, you're being taken advantage of by a gypsy fraud, and we can help you get your money back, all of these people asked for their money back. And my client didn't have the money anymore to give it back. The problem with that is that one of them had been her client for 34 years. Another one, a woman named Jude Devereaux, who was a New York Times best-selling author and who gave her about $12 million, had been her client for 16 years. And Rose had virtually lived with Jude and helped her every day with things. At what point does that warranty of I'll return your money if you're not happy expire? And I argued that to the jury. And they didn't find her guilty of the substantive charges. I believe they found her guilty of a conspiracy because her daughters-in-law, who she worked with on occasion, were going beyond what Rose was doing. But that's not really relevant. The point was, if you go into a department store here, you go to Bloomingdale's, and you buy a shirt, and you have a money-back guarantee, and you wear it for 16 years, and then you come back to Bloomingdale's and you say, I want my money back. Are you entitled to your money back?
That's what the whole case came down to.
That's what the case eventually came down to.
But she got convicted of that.
The jury said that she was guilty of fraud. She lost her appeal.
How long did she go away for?
The judge sentenced her to, the government wanted 30 years. The judge gave her 121 months, which is a year and a month. I'm sorry, 10 years and a month.
10 years and a month. Didn't she know that this conviction was coming? You said she's a psychic.
She didn't predict that she would be arrested. The government also seized 2 houses and about 16 cars from her and her family. And we were able to get those returned.
Incredible. That's once the conviction came down.
That was before the conviction came down. That was when we moved to dismiss the forfeiture part of the indictment as improperly returned.
So they forfeited all of the assets, and that was the end of the fortune teller.
I guess she predicted that she would get out of jail in 8.5 years.
Ultimately, she made a fortune from her clients, but ended up with her own personal misfortune that maybe she didn't see coming after all.
I think that's very poetic.
By the way, how much did she charge? Do you know?
It varied. A normal reading, I think, was about $80. But for other types of services, Drew Devereaux gave her $1 million a year for helping her live her life. Another one of her clients was a solicitor in London who she met at the plaza and she stayed in touch with for, I think, about 5 years. Another was a very famous businesswoman, not famous, very wealthy businesswoman. Another was a captain in the Navy who graduated from the Naval Academy, a woman captain.
Wow. It just goes to show, Fred, despite your level of education or experience, we all need someone to talk to.
That's basically it. She would solve problems. As a lawyer, what we do is solve people's problems. People come to us with a problem, and we help them with a solution. Either work it out without going to court or work it out in a trial or something. She would help them solve problems. She would give them advice, and they would follow it. And they paid her for it. And she went to jail for 10 years.
Incredible. Are the feds still chasing psychics these days, generally?
I haven't seen many federal psychic cases. Normally, it's the Gypsy Squad in various police departments.
They have squads just for gypsies?
Yeah, Fort Lauderdale had a Gypsy Squad, and they had 2 or 3 detectives assigned to it. And as a matter of fact, a Fort Lauderdale detective is the one who broke this case, found out how much money my client and her family were getting. There were 4 or 5 people in the family who told fortunes. And they went to the feds, and the feds indicted it.
Incredible. Wow. Fred, it's true. We all need someone to talk to, and I'm sure glad you stopped by today to talk to me and our listeners. I really appreciate your coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been interesting being able to babble like this.
That's in the ear of the listener, so I'll defer to them about that. But I always enjoy having criminal lawyers on. You guys always have great and exciting stories to tell and insights, because a lot of the public like to hear insights about these cases, not just what they hear on one news station or another. So thank you for sharing that with us. In the future, I will invite you to come back, either individually or as part of a panel, when these things pop up. So you can look for my
Thank you very much.
invitations. I know your office is right down the street here.
It actually is. I walked over.
And I wish you well. Thank you so much for
you.
coming. And that's a wrap. Thank you for tuning in to the Interesting Lawyers Podcast. See you next time.